we're going to go over midpoint of a line. Okay, so this formula here is going to cover midpoint of a line. When I write x, this is subscript, so it's not a power. We're just talking about the actual midpoint. It's an m.
It's an x2 plus x2.
1. Okay, so we have x, and the m stands for the midpoint. Okay, so the x value of the midpoint and the y value of the midpoint are equal to this formula. Now these are actually two formulas separated by a comma. Okay, we do the same process to find the x midpoint and the same process to find the y midpoint. Okay, what it says is x2 plus x1 divided by 2 will give us the x midpoint, and y2 plus y1 divided by 2 will give us the y midpoint. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're just going to choose 2 points. We have a coordinate of 2 and 4, and another coordinate of 8 and 5. Okay, now these 2 coordinates, I need to call one of them my x1, y1, and the other one my x2, y2. It doesn't actually matter which I call which, just as long as I stay consistent. So, for this argument's sake, we're going to say this is our first coordinate, this is our second. So, when I'm saying consistent, that means this needs to be x1, and if the 2 is x1, then the corresponding form needs to be y1. I can't mix them up. I can't say x1 and y2. Okay, so if that's our first point, it has to be the x1 and the y1 when plugging into this formula, which then makes this coordinate the x2 and the y2. As long as I'm consistent, I should be fine. So we're going to plot these 2 points, 2 and 4, and 8 and 5. Okay, we need to find the midpoint of this line segment here. So the midpoint is going to fall somewhere in the middle, and it looks like we're going to get some kind of decimal number. We need to solve this, okay? So we're going to plug it into the formula, and then I'm going to show you essentially what this formula is doing. This formula is kind of creating a right-angled triangle, all right? That's how we're finding the halfway points between 2 things. So what I mean by that is, for instance, the x, and we'll do that in red, let's say. We're really only dealing with those points there on the x, and we'll zoom in so it's a little easier to see. We're dealing with our 2 major coordinates of this x value and this x value here. And we're going to find the middle of the 2. That's what this formula does here. It finds x2, x1, adds them together, and divides by 2 to find what would be the exact middle. Okay? So we'll do that one to start. I'm going to write it a little smaller on the side. So x midpoint, y midpoint is equal to, and since I did that in dotted line red, I'll do this part in red. So x2 is the value of 8. So we're doing 8 plus x1 is 2 divided by 2. I'm going to leave the y part in formula form just for now. When you go to do it, obviously you can do it all in one step. We're going to do it one piece at a time. Okay. What is 8 plus 2?
10.
10? Good. So we're going to get 10 divided by 2. We'll continue with everything else. This is still y2 plus y1 divided by 2. And this is again telling us, and I'll put it in red, we're finding the x midpoint right now. Okay? And that's the y midpoint is equal to. And what is 10 divided by 2 going to be? 5. Excellent. So, in other words, Mark, x midpoint is going to be equal to the coordinate 5, which if we were to look at this line as if it was kind of like a right angle triangle, that would be halfway between our 2 and our 8. Looks like we move up 1, 2, 3, or we'd move down 1, 2, 3. Perfect. This would be our midpoint. Okay? So we know the midpoint of this line here, the x value is going to be 5. We now have to find out what the y value is going to be. So in order to find the y value, it's essentially the same type of idea. It said we use the y coordinates when going about it. So in this case, I'm dealing with only 2 major y coordinates. I'm dealing with this being y2 and this being y1, and I need to find essentially the midpoint between them. Now this one's a little easier to work with. We know it's going to pretty much be halfway between, but we're going to put it into the formula anyways. We'll do this part in green. So, we knew that the x midpoint was 5, and now our y, oops, sorry, I said I was going to do that in green. And the y midpoint is the next thing we're going to solve. It's going to be equal to, okay, 5 is still our x midpoint. Our y midpoint, we're going to plug in our two values. So what do we call y2? Well, y2 was 5, so we're going to plug that in for y2. And y1 was 4, so we're going to plug that in for y1. So we have 5 plus 4. 5 plus 4 divided by 2. That's going to give us what? 9 divided by 2. Okay. We'll bring down everything else. I'm going to try to keep them color-coded for you. And finally, what is 9 divided by 2?
4.5.
Excellent. 4.5. So the midpoint of this line segment was at 5 and 4.5. So if you notice our corresponding answer in the end, I want you guys to make sense of this because I know it can look silly. But the way this says is our x midpoint. This is how it refers to each other, okay? So the x midpoint is our 5, and the y midpoint is our 4.5. So this is the coordinate of the midpoint. Take out the entire page. And if we were to draw that in, that looks like it's going to be right here at 5 and 4.5. There's our midpoint, okay? Some of these you'll be almost able to look at and estimate where the midpoint is going to be. We're going to get into far more difficult questions where you're going to need to use this formula. So this formula you need to memorize when we go to finally write the test for this. You need to know this formula, okay? So remember, x2 plus x1 divided by 2, comma, they're not related to each other. It's a whole separate formula again. y2 plus y1 divided by 2. And those will give you your two coordinates, the x and y value. Write that in. That's our x and our y value of the midpoint.